All right, then our first paper is on employment impacts of the CHIPS Act. Will be presented by Eric Verheugen.
Much. It's a pleasure to be here. This is joint with Joe Stiglitz and Bill Gaerten, who are here. I also want to call out our two hardworking research assistants, Max Science and Victor Ortega, are sitting there in the back. Okay. So under the Biden administration, let's see, there's a little delay. Industrial policy underwent a revival in the United States. You might argue that industrial policy never really left the United States. It was just submerged. It happened a lot through defense procurement, but in any case, there's a more self-conscious embrace of industrial policy. The CHIPS Act is obviously a key element of that, and what we're trying to do in this paper is take a first step towards trying to evaluate this revival of industrial policy. The CHIPS Act obviously had several motivations. One, national security. There was also resilience to shocks following chip shortages under COVID, but also to create good, high-paying jobs. That latter one is what we're going to be focusing on in this paper. It's the one, given data traits, that we can focus on at this stage. And it's also, but quite politically salient, certainly in the past and most likely in the future. This paper is unusual relative, my own papers, but also I think relative to the space of academic papers, in that we're trying to evaluate impacts quite quickly. Our hope, which may have been naive, was that we could do so quickly enough to actually have some influence on the policy process. But that trying to do something this quickly generates various data constraints. So the microdata on plants, which would be ideal for doing this sort of evaluation from the annual survey of manufacturers or the census of manufacturers, is going to take still another couple of years probably before that's available. Employment, it's part of the reason why we decided to focus on it, is it becomes available sooner. But even so, this is the QCW's, the quarterly census of employment and wages. Just a couple of weeks ago, released the Q1 to 2025 data. The first finalized major CHIPS award was in November 2024. Okay, so obviously that's a very short, post-award window. In the long run, a great idea would be to compare, firms that got a preliminary memorandum of terms or initial agreement with the government, and then some of those, just because the election happened, they never got the finalized award. We can compare those to firms that got the finalized award, but that, given the timing, is not possible. What we're doing here is we're going to instead do county-level differences. And we're going to have two strategies, one prime one, and then I'm going to show some results on a second one as well. The first one is we're basically going to compare, so we know where all the semiconductor facilities are in the country, and we can compare counties that have a semiconductor facility to counties that have high-tech employment, as defined by the census, but no semiconductor facility. So that's our first sort of treatment control comparison. We're also going to do one where we're within the semiconductor sector. We can look at counties that have a fab, that have a fabrication facility, versus counties that have a semiconductor facility that's not a fab, and they don't have a fab. Okay, so that will be our second comparison. Attentive readers will notice that it was only the first comparison is in the draft that was circulated. In part, the second one has come through discussion with the discussants, and so it's kind of hot off the presses, but will be in the final version. Okay, what are we finding? My time is going fast. We're going to find strong anticipation effects. So we're going to argue that these effects began with the introduction of the USICA, a precursor bill. That's the United States Innovation and Competition Act back in May 2021. The bipartisan support was evident very early on, and we'll argue that we can see employment effects basically as a result of that. Just giving you the headline numbers, we're going to find a direct effect on jobs in the semiconductor sector of about 100 to 140 per affected county. That's using our baseline specification. It varies a little bit, but those results are pretty robust. We're also going to find local spillovers on employment within the same counties, within these semiconductor counties, on supplier industries, so industries that are selling to the semiconductor sector, and in non-residential construction. Okay, so there the magnitude is kind of similar, maybe a little bit bigger. If you were to do a back-of-the-envelope calculation where we just scale up those difference in difference estimates, and we know that's potentially controversial, and there's caveats that come with that, but we think in this case it may be appropriate. So you just basically multiply those per county effects by the number of affected counties. You get something on the order of 15,000 to 20,000 direct jobs in semiconductors, about 28 to 32,000 indirect jobs in construction and these input supply sectors. Is that a big or small number? It sort of depends. If you were to just look at the amount of spending per job, then this would not be an obvious way to create jobs. On the other hand, the employment was just one of the and arguably maybe not even the main motivation for the program. But I think our sense is that this increase was larger than many expected. I guess the Semiconductor Industry Association had a bigger number, but we're smaller than that. But it's larger than many expected, especially given the extreme capital intensity of the industry. Okay, a little bit of background. It was most of the funding under CHIPS was direct subsidies for production of semiconductors. Why? That is a strange error that we got. Okay, I don't know how that happened. Related to equipment and materials. And then there was also some R&D funding, and there was a tax credit, which was increased under Trump. The timing is going to be important for us. There were the first precursor bills, the Endless Frontiers Act and the Chips for America Act, were introduced back in May and June 2020. May 18th, 2021 was when this USICA was introduced in the Senate late in the day, and then June 28th, a couple of weeks later, it passed the Senate with bipartisan support. There were 19 Republican votes, including then Minority Leader Mitch McConnell. The House version in February, there was the July 27th, 28th is when the final revised bill passed the House and Senate, and then it was signed on August 9th. And then, as I said, the first major CHIPS award was finalized November 15th, 2024. Okay, so a lot of what we're saying can be summarized already in this picture. This is just raw data. This is the current employment survey data for the semiconductor sector. So it's 334413 for the NAICS nerds. That's the 6-digit sector. You can see, and then the line is, there's the first line is when the date when the USICA was introduced in the Senate. When the CHIPS bill was actually signed, you can see we're already sort of had reached a new level. And then there in July was when Biden dropped out. They couldn't fit, the labels wouldn't fit, so I just removed one of the labels. But the red one would be November 2024, where the first award and also the election. Okay, and then the question is, how much of that increase can be attributed to the CHIPS Act? We're not gonna have very much to say, partly for data constraints, about the decline, starting in July 2024, but we can speculate about that in the discussion. Okay, so one question, and again, this was also prompted by a discussant comment, would be to say, if it's the case that there's this anticipation effects and the changes in expectations of the market were partly what's driving, then you would expect to see the stock market reacting. When we do that, this is just, can I hide the floating meeting controls? Hold on.
Does that work?
Yeah, okay. So we're just do the standard, cumulative abnormal returns calculation. If you can, is this going to work? No. Okay, but, Can you see my, oops. Okay, yeah, no, I was just trying to use a pointer. But anyway, you can see that basically the date of introduction of the USICA, you do see an increase. This is just, I didn't list here. You can look at a different table in the paper to see, but these are the large semiconductor firms, the large publicly listed semiconductor firms. You do see an increase in these cumulative abnormal returns right on May 19th. The bill is introduced sort of May 18th in the afternoon. You don't see it so much when the bills actually pass, when USICA passed, or when the CHIPS Act passed. But arguably, the uncertainty had been resolved by that. Okay, a little bit more, just sort of anecdotal background. So there is evidence that companies responded pretty quickly. So July 19th, 2021, which was about a month after the USICA passed the Senate, it still wasn't a bill. Then you had Global Foundries in Malta, New York, had a press conference with Schumer and Raimondo. It was Schumer who claimed that it was CHIPS that did it. It wasn't the CEO. The CEO was a little bit more circumspect, but the CEO did say subsequently that they were taking advantage. So both they were expanding new facilities and they were expanding existing facilities and they were building a new facility. And he said that partly they decided to focus on expanding the new facilities, which could explain why in this picture Okay, so there's sort of a puzzle in this picture, which is, building a new fab takes 2 or 3 years, a new greenfield fab. And so the question is, how could employment have responded so quickly? And we think part of the answer is that they were just expanding existing facilities, as Global Foundries CEO claimed that they did. Another issue, which is going to come up, I think, in the discussion, is about the chips shortage, where people are responding to that. That is something that became evident already in the previous year and during 2020, and by January 2021, the wait times had spiked, and so people knew very, very clearly that there was a chip shortage. So that's another thing to come back to, but we think that the timing is not right for that story. As I mentioned, our main data set is the QCEW. That's based on UI records. Another issue is they do extensive suppression to preserve confidentiality, and so if you add up the county level, you don't get to the national level. We deal with that a couple different ways. One is we'll just impute zeros for missings. Most of the time, it's quite small places that have small employment and small numbers of establishments that get suppressed. So that's not too bad, but maybe it introduces some errors. So for robustness, we'll also just drop the missings and run the regressions again, and we get very similar results. The other thing we're doing is this is the Semiconductor Industry Association has a map of all the locations, and they cover 99% of the industry, so we're using that. If I have time, I'll talk about the quarterly workforce indicators, which we use to supplement the QCW. 5 minutes left. Okay. I've got to go even faster than I thought. Okay, so the basic strategy. Green here is counties with a semiconductor fab. Blue is they have a semiconductor facility but no fab. Red is they have high-tech employment, at least 100 high-tech employment, and no semiconductor facility. Okay, so our first strategy is blue and green together against red. Our second strategy is green against blue. All right, those are our two differences. Okay, the specification is plain vanilla, nothing complicated there. We also do an event study version, and we will do a synthetic difference in difference. You might be worried that taking the average of the control counties is not the same thing as maybe that's not a great match for the semiconductor counties. And so what this does is sort of optimally chooses those weights, that omega and the lambda over there, in order to fit the trends. Between sort of it's a weighted average of control group counties versus the treatment group counties. The key thing is that we have parallel trends. The trends would have been parallel in the absence of chips. Okay, so there's our difference in difference event study graph. That looks, usually my difference in difference graphs don't look this good, right? So it's really pretty flat, but prior to the second quarter of 2021, and then we see a pretty clear increase that's highly significant. Okay, so I'd say that already is in my mind relatively convincing. When you do the synthetic difference in difference, it looks similar. You get rid of a little bit of the noise in the pre-trend, but otherwise results seem to be pretty robust. Those are the table versions where we're constraining the coefficient to be the same in the post period. What post means is a little bit complicated here. We can do the more conservative assumption which is panel A, would be just post USICA, post the introduction of the bill in the Senate. Given the picture, you might say, well, we should really look post signing of chips is where we reached the new level. Given that it was the employment was increasing over that time, you're going to get bigger effects when you do post chips as opposed to post USICA. So panel B, we're just omitting those quarters in between. But either way, it doesn't really matter. When you do the synthetic difference, again, you find something similar. Well, let me say, so we do this. The column 1 is just in that 6-digit industry for semiconductors. Column 2 would be semiconductor equipment and materials. So there's a question about whether those should be considered like input sectors or spillovers, or whether those are direct effects of chips. Chips did target. It said it was going to give money to semiconductor equipment and semiconductor materials producers. That money never actually went out the door. It was never finalized, but that was part of the idea. And so if firms may plausibly have raised their expectation they'd be getting money directly from the government, so we're going to consider that a direct effect. Okay, spillovers, I've got 2 minutes. Spillovers, so here, if you look now, this is not semiconductor equipment and materials, but it's sectors that sell to semiconductors in column 1. So we have a set of 11 of those. The NAICS codes are listed there. We didn't have space to list all the names, but we are seeing effects on those supplier sectors, and then also on non-residential construction. Again, so in these semiconductor counties against the non-semiconductor counties. There are some additional results. Maybe I'll come back to those in the discussion. And just in my last minute or two, This is now the second difference in difference strategy. We're comparing within the semiconductor industry, or counties that have semiconductor facilities, ones that have fabs versus ones that don't have fabs. And when we do that, then we find, again, pretty similar numbers, even bigger, actually. So there you go from about 200, where before we had about 100 jobs per county. Again, with the two definitions of what post means. If you can do that in the synthetic D&D, and you get something very similar. Okay, so. 1 minute. The question is, so you go for the difference in difference estimates relative impacts between the treatment control group. There's potentially a missing intercept problem. This is to macro audiences will be very familiar with this. If there's an aggregate effect of chips, that would end up in the intercept. It wouldn't show up in the difference in difference estimate. That's potentially a problem when you're trying to estimate sort of the aggregate or the national effects of a program like this. The most widely accepted solution is to structurally estimate a model of the macroeconomy. That's beyond what we feel we can do in this paper. We do argue, though, following Gabe's, it's a good choice of discussing, following Gabe's work, we argue that in this case, probably just scaling up the difference in difference estimates is okay. Why? The counties are small relative to the macroeconomy. Labor mobility is small between the treated group and the control group. Certainly using our first strategy. The CHIPS funding seems large, but it's not that large relative to the size of the macroeconomy. And so, given those arguments, if you Gabe's paper would say, probably scaling up is going to be okay. And the other thing that was quite reassuring to us is when we do scale up. So we just take our 100 to 140, multiply it by 149, which is the number of counties, then we get a range between about 14,900 and 20,860. If you went back to that original, sorry, again, I did poorly, somehow I got that weird error again, but the estimate from the raw time series, if you just looked at the change in the levels, that went from about 185,000 to 203,000, so about 18,000 jobs, just looking at the shift in levels, and that's more or less smack dab in the middle of this range. Okay, so that's pretty reassuring. Okay, 6 seconds. Those are our main findings. Those are the direct impacts. We need more research on other outcomes. Output, productivity, profits obviously would be interesting. On longer-term impacts, we'll have to wait for data to become available. There's a section in the paper about design issues that are raised by this, of which there are several important ones. Is it better to do targeted subsidies or to do tax credits? Is it, how can government claim part of the upside, which is particularly salient given that the Trump administration has taken a share of Intel, and how should social policy be embedded in industrial policy? Okay, I'm done. Thanks.
Thank you, Eric. We won't ask you to talk faster. The first discussant is Gabe Chodorow-Wright.
All right, thank you. While this comes up, I'll just thank John and Jan for inviting me to discuss, putting together a great program. This is, I'm assuming I'm not on the clock till you're done here. So,
Or reset.
This is a very ambitious paper trying to do essentially real-time analysis. It is well written. The authors are very clear and upfront about the challenges that come with that. We've had a very good back and forth already, and this discussion is meant to continue in that vein. Eric, speaking very quickly but very clearly, did a good job of summarizing what they do. This is essentially what I think are the 4 claims you should take from the paper. The first, this was a bill that actually was intended to create jobs. That was part of what it was trying to do. Second, that there was an increase in national employment in semiconductor production around the time of CHIPS. Third, it grew more in counties with semiconductor facilities, a direct effect on the order of 15,000 jobs, and fourth, some spillover to related industries. I'm going to do essentially 2 things in this discussion. First, I'll talk about how I view the county level comparisons, and I'll bring in some other data and variation to try and understand what's going on. And the second, to talk about the part that was at the very end there, the aggregation. How do we go from these county level or industry level effects to the aggregate? Okay. So the empirical strategy I think of as having a few parts, and I'm going to sort of take them in order. The first question is essentially, was the growth in semiconductor employment around the time of the CHIPS Act abnormally fast? And abnormally means relative to some benchmark baseline. The exercise in the paper I'm going to think and try and show you is essentially giving an unweighted change of employment in semiconductors across counties. And so it's maybe not so surprising that it aggregates up to what the national employment looks like. And for those who do this sort of thing, I just want to highlight this is very different from looking at the spillover. Think of the Keynesian multiplier on non-tradable industries when there's some increase in tradable demand in a particular county, where the argument is those counties are similar on those non-tradable dimensions as counties that are not treated. This is more like the first stage of that exercise, where you're just trying to see, is there an increase in employment in semiconductors after the spending on semiconductors? All right, so here's a version of the timeline similar to what Eric showed, just keeping in mind we don't have the award data yet. The awards aren't made until November of 2024. The awards specify construction plans that start in 2026, 2027, 2028. So this is all very anticipatory, and in that sense, it's very reduced form. We don't know where the spending actually went. Here's total employment in the CES or the QCEW. The CES is benchmarked to the QCEW, so these things are going to be the same until the part where we haven't benchmarked it yet. And you can see an increase in national employment in semiconductor production around the time of the CHIPS Act. Now, why do we want a control? Why are we going to county level analysis? There are other things happening at the same time. This is around the time of the reopening of the economy post-COVID, when people are starting to get vaccines. So if you plotted industry employment growth for a lot of industries, you would see growth around this period. And so the question we want to get at is semiconductor employment growth abnormally fast? So here's how I think of as essentially the diff and diff that's being done in the paper. So it says treated one, control one, because this is the first main strategy that Eric talked about that's in the paper, and then I'll do 2 and 3 separately. So the green line is add up total semiconductor employment in the counties that have these production facilities. Eric sent me their data, so this is using their treated counties. The yellow line is the control group, so that's employment in the untreated counties, except for I've shifted it up by 60,000 just to make it fit on that piece on the slide. It's essentially 0. There's almost by construction no semiconductor production employment in counties that don't have semiconductor production facilities. Why is the treated line so much below the total? That's because of the missing data issue. So the red line is if you add up county employment in semiconductor production in the QCEW, you get the red line, which is different from the blue line because of the missing industries. And so when I say the diff and diff is essentially giving an unweighted increase in employment nationally, this is what I mean. The control group just really isn't doing much work. This is the second version of the exercise. This is the third version. I'm not sure which is the second, which is the third relative to what Eric showed, but they all sort of have the same sort of flavor of this comparison. Just to hammer, if you use a QCW, I don't think the missing data is trivial. So here's a list of, after the awards were made, the counties that got the most dollars in awards. First, you see a huge amount go to Arizona, and it's sort of mind-boggling that these were not announced before the 2024 election, given the political realities of the time. But just I'll highlight that quote from the CEO of Global Foundries, the Malta plant, that's Saratoga, New York. There's no data in the QCW for Saratoga, New York, because it's suppressed, because there's not enough establishments there. Okay, so let me come back and ask, what's another way of generating a control group that would have a little more bite? So this is actually what I thought the paper was doing the first 2 times I read it, and then I finally understood. So the black line here is still employment in semiconductor manufacturing. The blue line is employment nationally in the other high-tech industries that form the basis for the first control group. So if you look at these and you look around the passage and the run-up to CHIPS, you don't see much difference. But there's a big pre-trend in the other high-tech category. So one thing you might do is try and get rid of that pre-trend, doing something like a diff and diff, or you can do a synthetic difference in difference, which is going to put more weight on certain of those industries. And then you get something like the red line. So that's what I call synthetic semiconductor employment. And sort of by construction, it's going to pick out weights so that the pre-trends look pretty good. And then you can see actually closer to when the actual bill is signed than ahead of the bill is signed, but there is more employment growth in semiconductor employment than in these other high-tech industries. Okay, so that's a sense in which there is some abnormal employment growth. If you take, I did this in growth rates rather than levels. If you aggregate it up, it's like 6,000, like 12,000 jobs, 6 to 12,000 jobs. that probably understates it because a lot of the weight in that synthetic group is on computers and peripheral equipment and communications equipment, which are downstream from semiconductors. So if you're doing more semiconductor production, you could imagine you would do more of those as well. Okay, so coming back to the first question, did semiconductor employment grow abnormally fast? I'll say, I think more likely than not, taking the balance of this evidence, the evidence the authors have put together, but it's certainly not a slam dunk case because we're in a period where employment is growing a lot everywhere, and it's hard to come up with control group. That was my best attempt. Okay, second question is this abnormal employment growth due to chips? And again, remember, we don't actually have the dollars going out through chips until much later, so this is all anticipatory. Now that when we think about chips and employment and what would be a confounder, we all think about AI and AI demand. I don't think that's the biggest issue. I think it's the shortages coming out of COVID. The paper talks about this. The authors have thought about it. I think it's a little bit more potentially of a big deal than they do, and so I think it's worth airing. So first, just to remind you that this was a big deal and something we all talked about. It showed up in inflation measures. It was a big part of the transitory permanent inflation debate. There were big headlines. Chip shortages are starting to hit consumers. That's June 2021. Global chips crisis hits automakers hard. Remember, we couldn't build cars because we didn't have the chips for them. Here's one that I found particularly interesting. This is January 2022, and the Commerce Department, it turns out, actually ran a survey of how much inventory did production companies have of chips. And before COVID, it was like 40 days worth. At the time they ran it, it was 5 days worth, so way low. And what did the Commerce Secretary say? She said the results show the need to pass the CHIPS Act. So I think the question is, did chips cause the employment that we're seeing around this period, or did the semiconductor shortage cause both an employment boom, because you need to make more chips to satisfy this shortage, and did it also help to spur the CHIPS Act? Or maybe both were necessary conditions. Maybe nobody would invest and hire more in chips if you didn't have this promise of additional dollars coming down the road, even despite the shortages. So I think the answer to the second question is possibly. It is totally possible that chips played a big role here. I think it's hard to have a lot of confidence in that because there is a very plausible alternative story. The third question in the paper, in the empirical part, is were there spillovers upstream, so into construction of factories, into the inputs in chips? I think the answers to those are basically going to be the same way that you come down on these questions. If you believe that chips cause employment and increase production, it's natural that it would have spilled upstream as well. All right. Second part I want to talk about is how do we go from either the county level or if I did industry level employment growth to thinking about is there an effect on national jobs. This is a slide that I use a lot in discussions, usually about local multipliers, which are geographic-based, but it basically applies to industry-based stuff as well. Different caveats. Is it outside finance, inside finance? The second one is the one I'll focus on, which is monetary policy. And often we're talking about stimulus done in a recession. The Fed's at the zero lower bound. I argue, it's roughly plausible that we have a fixed interest rate, so you don't have to worry about monetary policy crowd out. That ain't what's going on here. So just to remind you, here's macroeconomic context, vacancy unemployment ratio, labor market's getting really tight, core inflation is high, and the Fed is hiking interest rates to try and head this off just at the time that this employment is going. So I think I was a freshman in college and Larry Lindsay came to my introductory economics class and he was defending the Bush tax cuts and saying, of course, they had been planned during the campaign and it was a boom, but this was the best time stimulus ever because they came just at the start of the 2001 recession. This is, if you think of there being a jobs program in a federal legislation in 2022, it's like the worst timed stimulus ever because it's coming exactly when the Fed is trying to hike and head things off. So, the argument in the paper, and I not surprisingly endorsed the framework, is the local effect on chips is just not big enough to matter. The Fed just isn't going to pay attention to a marginal $20,000, $30,000 jobs. That might be right, but there's sort of a corollary of that, which is you can't really sell a bill in 2022 or 2021 as being a jobs bill, because as soon as it gets big enough to have any macroeconomic relevance, the Fed was going to react to it and reduce. That doesn't mean there aren't beneficial macroeconomic side effects. More capital is good for workers, even if it doesn't increase L. Of course, this is also a period when more capital and investment might have been also pushing up interest rates more and doing crowd out. So I think it takes a little bit more to make a conclusion. And I'll say the last thing, it is sort of surprising how long it took to make these awards and get things going. And there are a lot of requirements in the CHIPS Act, from daycare to water usage to reaching out to multiple local community colleges to do targeted hiring. And I have some thoughts on that, but I'm out of time.
Thanks, Gabe. The second discussant is Penny Goldberg.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to discuss this paper. It's a paper on a very interesting research agenda. Let me, okay. It's a paper on a very interesting research agenda, and I'm sure there will be many papers in the near future to come out of this work. The current paper has three main results. So the first is that there are large anticipation effects of the CHIPS Act. The second main result is that there are significant employment and also wage effects in the semiconductor sector at the county level. And I've underlined the word semiconductor sector. This is not about aggregate employment. It's not about employment in the high-tech sector. It's just about employment in semiconductors. These results are based on a diff and diff strategy, so they are relative effects, and the authors are extremely defensive about it. But given the research design and the focus on the semiconductor employment and Gabe's comment, they also likely affect effects at the national level. So it's fair to say that it seems that employment in the semiconductor sector has increased. The third result is that there are also significant spillover effects on upstream sectors. That said, there are no aggregate employment effects, not even at the county level. So there is no evidence that employment at the county level has increased. So these are the main results. And as I said, this is an ongoing project on an ongoing policy initiative. So it's a very unusual piece of work. The authors expect more data to come in the near future, and therefore there will be also many more results. At this point, the paper can only document credibly anticipation effects. It's important to point this out because this raises the question of what the interpretation of these anticipation effects is. So as a starter, the identification, and again, the authors are very clear about that, is based on a comparison of counties that have semiconductor production facilities, so counties that have foundries, to counties that have not. There are no data on awards that they exploit yet. As it turns out, most awards were made very recently, so this is a graph that comes from the IEEE spectrum. This is the Journal of the Association of the Electric and Electronic Engineers. And what the graph shows is that almost all awards, around $30 billion, were made after November 2024, so after the elections. That's when the CHIPS office gets its act together and they start making these awards. These awards continue to January and February 2025, and all indications are that they're going to continue making these awards. At the same time, if you compare this graph to the graph in the paper in figure 3, what you see is that employment starts rising in the semiconductor sector much earlier. This is the result that is highlighted in the paper. There are these anticipation effects. Everyone thinks the semiconductor sector is going to take off. But what's really striking is if you see what happens after the red line is November 2024. So this is when the awards are being made. So this is when the money starts coming in. And just as the money starts coming in, employment goes down. So I think it's a little premature to declare this an employment success. So this would give me pause. My interpretation that I asked the authors to look into that is that this decline reflects the layoffs by Intel. The order of magnitude is right. It's about 15,000 jobs that are getting cut during that time. There are another 20,000 jobs that may be cut this year. So the order of magnitude is right. But this is relevant because Intel was one of the great beneficiaries of this program. It's a great company. It seemed an obvious company to support. So the fact that this company does not seem to be doing well, despite the support, is relevant when we judge the CHIPS Act. So what's a possible interpretation of all these anticipation effects? So I think to a certain extent, it reflects this euphoria in the private sector, in the semiconductor sector, about the prospects, about the future of the sector. And I think this is due to the government's commitment to that sector. So I will use here my second mover advantage, so the fact that I'm a second discussant, to briefly comment on Gabe's concern that demand for semiconductors, demand for chips is rising. This is true, but there has always been enormous demand for chips over the past few decades. And one needs to wonder why there was no manufacturing. Manufacturing has really stopped in the United States. This is because other countries were much more competitive, Taiwan, Korea. The private sector in the US would never have attempted to enter that space without commitment from the government, simply because it's not cost competitive. So no matter how high the demand was, there is no way they could have been successful without government support, and it's clear, it's still unclear if they're going to be successful one day. But I think the government's support was very important to create these expectations. And another possible interpretation is also many of these companies are getting ready to bid for these awards. Remember again, all these employment increases are happening before the awards are made. So perhaps they need to demonstrate they have the capacity to actually deliver chips. So they ramp up employment to show they can actually produce, but it's likely that afterwards employment levels off. So this would suggest that these effects could be short-lived. And so again, the long-run effects could be more interesting, but we'll have to wait for those. Continuing about some reactions on the paper. So I would like to point out that the CHIPS Act was never really about employment. And the main goal was to increase resilience and decrease dependency on geopolitically sensitive areas, importantly Taiwan. And there was some debate as to whether one should focus on legacy versus mainstream chips versus leading-edge chips. Reading the literature, it seems one of the main motivations was actually to be able one day to produce these advanced chips, these leading-edge chips. And the concern there was that right now, Taiwan, TSMC, just one company, commands around 93% of the market, with the other 7% dominated by Korea. So it's clear that if something happens to Taiwan, the world economy would face a major crisis in this space. So there was clearly demand for these leading-edge chips to be produced elsewhere, but as it turns out, it's very hard to start producing from scratch. So many saw this production of legacy or mainstream chips as a first step towards being able to produce these leading-edge chips one day. So I mention that because this is relevant to the issue of policy design. So ultimately, one day, this program is going to be judged based on whether these foundries, these companies, will be able to produce chips, and especially advanced logic chips. That said, I'm very sympathetic to what the authors say in the paper, that employment effects are also important because the political economy dictates that the government, when it presented all these proposals to Congress, it had to make the case that actually this industrial policy is going to generate also jobs domestically. You cannot imagine policymakers going to Congress and saying, well, we need to support our friends in Korea or Japan in order to increase resilience of the sector. So I'm sympathetic to the to the claim that employment effects are relevant, but this is not fiscal policy. The main motivation behind this policy was not really employment. Now, conditional on employment, taking the focus on employment as given, I would further claim that the aggregate employment was never really of interest because the US economy for many years has been near full employment. And if anything, after COVID, we've had labor shortages. So it seems to me sometimes policymakers are on autopilot. When you present a policy, you need to say this creates jobs. But why do you want to generate jobs when we have labor shortages? So the issue was never to create jobs. There are, however, two employment-related aspects that were of interest. So the first one is related to this issue of spatial inequality. So one of the motivations, I think, of IRA and, in general, industrial policy during the previous administration was also to support counties and areas in the US that had been left behind. And even though many policies were targeted towards specific sectors, like semiconductors in this case, there was an effort made to also channel resources towards communities that had been left behind. So you can think of this as being place-based policy. And if that if you take this motivation as relevant, then I would argue that actually the definitive strategy is spot on. Then you want to look at relative effects. You don't care about absolute effects. And that's why I said before, I think the authors may be a little too defensive. If that's your focus, you do want to look at relative effects. The second employment-related aspect is that there was also demand for good jobs, not demand for jobs, but demand for good jobs. And so there is a question. The question there is, were these additional jobs created really good jobs? And I will come to that in a moment. Now, first, on the first question on employment effects and spatial inequality, very quickly here, if you look at papers table 1, these are clearly not the communities that were left behind, the communities in which there are semiconductor facilities. Even if you compare the treated communities to the treated counties, to the control counties, these were better off. But in general, these are communities, these are areas that have high-tech industry. They are more urban, they are larger, they have higher wages. So from that point of view, this does not seem to be the right targeting. On the other hand, when it comes to good jobs, semiconductor jobs have always been considered to be good jobs, and there was also this expectation that one day we may be able to create jobs like the ones people used to have in Motorola, IBM, Intel, all these golden companies of the past. So that raises two questions. The first one is, who gets these additional jobs in the paper? So are these engineers? Are they lawyers and accountants that are just preparing the proposals and the budget? Are these skilled workers, or are they low-skilled service workers? So workers who work in the cafeteria, maybe workers on short-term contracts. And I think the authors are ideally situated to actually answer these questions with the microdata they have. Again, this will come in the future. The second question, and that I think there will be some overlap with what Gabe said. There is also the question, where did this additional employment come from? So we know it didn't come from semiconductor employment in other counties, the control groups, simply because there is no semiconductor employment in these counties. But there are other possibilities. So the worst case is that they come from other countries. So the highly publicized case of TSMC, bringing workers, bringing professionals from TSMC Taiwan is a case in point. Now, we assume these are only very few cases. They received a lot of attention. I assume they don't matter in the aggregate data. Nevertheless, these are really highly skilled engineers and other professionals, highly paid. So you don't want these jobs to go to foreigners from the employment point of view. Very plausibly, they came from other high-tech sectors within the same county, or other high-tech sectors from other counties. And if this happened, then there is crowding out of skilled work in other sectors. The ideal case, the dream case, of course, is that they came out of non-employment and also out of fresh graduates. People graduate from college and they get these jobs. So with the micro data, so specifically matched employer-employee data, one can look at these questions, and again, the authors, I believe, can look at all these things. In the meantime, another thing they could do is, rather than looking at semiconductor employment, that's the relevant dependent variable, they could look more broadly on employment in high-tech sectors or employment among high-skilled workers. I think this is in line with what also Gabe suggested, because this would allow them to examine spillovers, potentially negative spillovers to other sectors. And it's very hard to see how chips in the short run could have increased employment without crowding out of other sectors. In short, and I'm concluding, I don't believe the employment effects were the most interesting aspect of the CHIPS Act, but to the extent that one focuses on the employment effects, the most interesting question regards the kind of jobs that were created and the sources of this additional employment. And this might be the most interesting question also in the long run, to the extent that CHIPS generates incentives for people to invest in the right skills, in the right specialties, and increase their human capital. There could be positive long-run effects. So again, this can lead to a very promising and very rich research agenda in the future, and I'm looking very much forward to reading future drafts. Thank you.
Thanks, Penny. We'll open it up for the floor discussion now, and we'll get back to the authors so you can respond to the discussants, but we want to get some floor comments in. Let me start with John Halterwanger.
So really interesting paper and discussion. I think this paper reminds us that, I'll say, timely processing and access to the microdata can be really valuable. But actually, I wanted to talk about a data set that just got released this morning that I think sheds a little bit of light. So the business dynamic statistics through 2023 was released this morning. It has information on job creation and job destruction at a detailed industry level, and establishment entry and exit, including in the semiconductor industry. So I just looked at it. I haven't obviously had a chance to analyze it, do a diff and diff or anything like that. But one thing that seems to come out from my eyeballing of the statistics is this increase in employment was very much associated with a decline in establishment exits. No. And actually a decline also in job destruction for continuing establishment. So is that a good thing or bad thing? We don't know. This is related to Eric's point. We need to look further. We do know there's very extensive evidence that who are the establishments that tend to exit? The poorly performing establishments. So the question is what did this do? Prop up some businesses that might have exited otherwise.
Catherine, and then Justin.
Thank you. It's a very interesting paper. I had a comment about the results on the effects on total employment at the county level, which I guess I'm a little worried about. It may be that you wouldn't have expected to see much, but there were other things going on at the same time that might have affected county employment in the control group. The CHIPS Act was passed in August of 2022. That's the same time that the Inflation Reduction Act was passed. That had a whole bunch of money for clean energy, advanced manufacturing, all that kind of thing. It's true that if you look at how employment was trending in the other high-tech counties as compared to the semiconductor counties before that, it looked pretty similar. But if those other counties were also experiencing a shock, that might have affected their total employment. So I'm not convinced that the comparison between the semiconductor counties and the other high-tech counties is really just picking up what the CHIPS Act might have done. I think that this might explain why you're not seeing anything at all.
Okay. Justin, and then go ahead, Jen.
I just wanted to talk about linguistics. So I spent a lot of time with applied micro people, and when they run these sorts of regressions and they find that the effects of a policy or the measured effects of a policy predate the policy, they call that a failure of a robustness test. When you hang out with macroeconomists, they call it anticipation effects. And they're very pleased to have found such forward-looking agents. Look, figuring out exactly when this should have had an effect is a hard thing, right? Was it once it became likely once it passed or once the money comes out. So maybe both of those groups are at extremes that aren't quite right, but maybe what we should do is recognize that there's some multiple hypothesis testing going on here. Only you know what you did in the privacy of your own stata, but my guess is you tried the regressions one way and then you tried them the other way, in which case we should really see Bonferroni adjustments to all of this. The second linguistic thing is to think about what a control group is. So the diff and diff, and I think Gabe pointed this out well, is employment in chip production in counties with chip production plants. And the control group is employment in chip production in counties without chip production plants, which kind of obviously is zero. The point of a control group is not to find a group that's unaffected by a policy, it's to find a group that otherwise would have followed the same path. And so I think when you just think about the economics of what a useful control group here would be, that wouldn't be one. And so I think Gabe missed the opportunity to say what you did, in fact, it was by subtracting zero was not a diff in diff, it was a diff. And so, you know, it's a little less persuasive that way. And I think finally, Penny's point might be more starkly stated this way. For what set of coefficients of the effects on employment, and even taking account of everything that Gabe said about how to interpret the coefficients, if we're looking at employment, for what set of coefficients would one have judged this to have been a failed policy?
Yan Chen and then David Romer.
My question is more on the scalability of the policy. It's relevant to aggregation to national level as well as relevant for scalability of future industrial policies. I was wondering if this policy were implemented like at the national level, would some counties quickly hit labor supply bottlenecks given the shifts in immigration policies, and more recently, if it were for future industrial policies, we have now a shift in immigration policy targeting at high-skilled workers under H-1B.
David?
I think Penelope pointed out that the main goal of the act wasn't to help workers, but if that were what we're looking at, I don't think this is the right place to look. So basically, we're looking at the short run. One possible effect of the act is we picked up some people who were in bad jobs and put them into good jobs, and that would be good, but that effect seems to be small, and it's, as Penelope pointed out, most likely those people were skilled already, and the estimates just don't speak to that question. But I think you'd look more at two other channels the paper is silent about. One is, and Gabe alluded to this, it increases the incentives for investment of a certain type. More capital is good for workers. Some of the workers who got moved into the sector probably got higher wages because their marginal products have gone up. There would be some crowding out, but we don't think that's one for one with higher investment demand. So one could look at that. I think the bigger one, it's extremely hard, but we think the semiconductor industry is sort of rife with learning by doing and R&D effects, and if more of that is done domestically, that could raise productivity in various ways, or cause technological progress. I would think those two things would most likely sort of swamp the good jobs effects in terms of the magnitude of the potential benefits for workers.
Tristan Reed.
Thanks. Great paper. I just wanted to point out the wage effects. So these seem very large. So in table 4, I'm just looking at the diff and diff. It seems about a 50% increase in semiconductors sector and 100% in semiconductor production equipment and materials. So this seems to suggest that there's a pretty inelastic labor supply. I think you could report an elasticity would be useful, but this seems to also motivate Penny's suggestion that we should look for kind of crowd out and decreases in employment in other related industries.
Okay. Tarek Hassan.
I'm wondering to what extent the subsidy might be undone by putting a tariff on the machines that you need to produce the chips.
Okay, and John Sablehouse?
Thanks. If the objective of the policy was to get the jobs here in the U.S., I'm wondering if there's any evidence that the complement happened, which is a reduction in the number of CHIPS jobs overseas. Any evidence of that, or the stock prices of companies that would have been producing those chips overseas?
Is there another question? Yeah. Sorry. Oh, Gerald, sorry. Gerald Cohen.
I guess I'd like to ask a follow-up around the tariff question, which is I'd like to see what happens if you do this paper after they stopped giving money to a bunch of people who anticipated that they were going to get money, and what happened to those jobs. And then this broader question about what do you do when you implement a policy that is time inconsistent?
Okay, let's go back to the authors, and there's a lot there for you to respond to, but you have pick and choose discretion. So.
Sorry, you want yeah.
You start.
I start. Okay. So thank you so much. These were great discussions. We had a great productive sort of interchange also before today. So really appreciate that. A couple of things. One is, so this is a difference in difference. It's not a randomized experiment. Differences always have issues that, there could be something group specific happening, which would then, give rise to the effects. There are a couple of things, a couple of directions one might go. One is to try and find a different control group, a better one. We were talking earlier about, international comparison, which would be very useful. Penny brought up the other high-tech employment as an outcome, right? That would be, that would be a useful thing to do. The other thing I think to do is to talk about other stories. What is this thing that we think is affecting the treatment group? One was AI. We think that the timing is off for that. The AI boom started later. The other one, which we think is a real concern, is this thing about the chip shortage. If we could, I have one slide. If you could tell them to show it. Maybe it's just from a Bloomberg article that we cited in the paper. You look at when the wait times for chips spiked. It was much before when employment spiked. Right now, it could be there's a 5-month delay that companies just took companies 5. It's the slide after the references if the person can so I don't have to stand up. If the it could be that companies just waited for 5 months before reacting, but we think that's unlikely. We think it's more likely that go through to the references and then the next slide. Sorry, you have to make you scroll through everything. Okay, so so we have there a whole bunch of things that are going on. There's this one, yes. So that's just from Bloomberg. That came out in March 2021. You can see in January 2021 was when the spike was happening. The USICA was May and June when you actually see employment going up. So we think when you look at the other stories or the Intel story, might be behind also the decline afterwards. As far as I can tell, I was looking for news articles. That decline happened in the first layoffs were until November 2024. So it wouldn't explain the decline, even though they announced it in August. It wouldn't explain the decline after that. Should we go through every comment and try and rebut, or there's so many,
why don't
John
you
brings
pick
new
the main
definitions.
ones and look for themes?
Yeah.
So.
Okay, let me just say, John, it's like new meaning to the term real-time analysis, doing this in person. Let me try and respond to Justin a little bit, who's maybe the most critical. So we did have the second difference in difference strategy, which is really not in the paper that was circulated, but where it's within semiconductors, and it's non-fab versus fab semiconductors. We're finding very similar results. You might say the non-fab, the employment's still small there, so Gabe's point still applies, but that I think which we're adding should respond to your main criticism. Joe.
What? Yeah, let me pick up a couple of the themes. I agree that the main reason for the act was resilience, not being reliant on Taiwan for our chips. And one way you can think of this is if we were in a period of unemployment, which wasn't, but an increase, a generation of jobs, there's a shadow price on employment, and it reduces the net cost of resilience. So we're paying a lot for resilience. I think we needed to pay a lot for resilience, and you can think of what we're doing here is giving a basis of a calculation of the net cost. So even if it's not the main effect, it is part of a social welfare calculation. On the issue of the various interpretations of what is going on, learning by doing is an important aspect of industrial policy. It's one of the arguments for industrial policy. And if firms rationally expect there to be learning by doing, that has an anticipation effect on their labor demand. So their demand for labor includes the benefit, the incremental benefit from learning. And so you would see that as if it were an anticipation effect. So, that's, again, an interpretation. That helps clarify another set of issues in industrial policy we can't get into. Is the problem that we're trying to address a lack of capital, or subsidizing some industries because the social value is greater than the private value? And in some ways, the fact that Intel distributed so much money in the period before undermines the argument that the real motive was a shortage of capital. If there was a shortage of capital, it was a man-made shortage, and we wouldn't want to incentivize that kind of creation of the shortage of capital. But I think there is an incentive effect, and that and the fact that it was discretionary raises an issue. In discretionary, you would want to not give it to the worst. You might want to give it to the middle because, and you don't need to give it to the top. So the differential effect on the quality is complex, and I don't think we can parse it out in our analysis, but at least it can inform our interpretation a little bit of what is going on. The one aspect of what is going on, again, interpretation, comes out of the fact that there were large wage increases, and I think that does suggest that there was obviously some crowding out. But it also suggests another reason why there might be anticipation effects. If you are in a labor market which is relatively tight, and you anticipate that you might get an award, you would start, I would say, hoarding labor. You would start hiring in anticipation, and knowing that there's a shadow price on labor that is higher than the market price. That also means that after it's resolved who gets it, those who bought it, who hired labor, hoarded labor, if you want, in anticipation of that they might get it, would then fire those workers. And then November 2024, if I can remember correctly, there was another big event that might have had some effect on anticipations of whether grants might be repealed. You might not get the checks that you had happened. There might be other, hostility. So the whole environment changed very dramatically there, and you would think that just the opposite would be going on relative to anticipation. I think, I want to say both. It's been a really rich discussion, a lot of interesting things that we can't, obviously direct. But there was one that Penny raised that I thought was particularly interesting, which is the spatial allocation. It is true that the tech counties are, on average, higher wage, but one could ask the question, among the tech counties, was there attention to the labor market? There are not all great labor markets. There were some that might be weaker. And try to contrast that with maybe a political economy explanation that, when you see Arizona there, you start thinking maybe politics might have affected the allocation. And of course, that is one of the big issues always in industrial policy. So I think not in this paper, but in the next paper, the issue of using this kind of methodology to try to identify what are some of the drivers of the allocation process. It was, there were many reasons, and finally, for the delay, there are a lot of requirements that were put in, but part of the delay was they wanted to do a good job because they didn't want this standard political economy criticism that they hadn't done their due diligence and so forth. So they were trying to balance a number of considerations, and that takes time. And contrast with IRA, where you mainly had a credit, tax credit, where you just you write the regs on who gets the tax credit, and then they get to decide who takes it up. And that's an important part of the design of industrial policy.
Go ahead, Aaron.
Two quick things. One was on wages, Tristan's point. We do have wage effects. The question was whether they're too large. Partly when we do our second design, they're not very robust, so I probably didn't talk about them very much. But also we make no attempt to control for composition, right? So if you're hiring a bunch of engineers who tend to be higher wage than the line workers, then you're going to have a high wage effect in our estimates. And so we think that's partly what's going on. As far as the anticipation, back to the multiple hypothesis testing, here this is all documented in an email. We've just said it's the passage of USICA, and Gabe said, go look at the stock market. Do you see it? We went and looked at the stock market. We found it was March 19th and not June 8th. But at least that part, I think we're somewhat insulated against that criticism by the fact that it wasn't us that decided to go look at it.
Sure. Bilge, go ahead.
Okay, thanks for your great comments. So I think just want to say a few things about the spatial inequality comment. So when we look at the QWI data set, which is not entirely comparable to the main data set that we work with, because the missings are much more when you go into the smaller groups. But what we see there is actually more concerning for inequality, because a lot of these increases actually came from college-educated workers. We see more male workers and more white workers relative to non-white. So it seems like preliminary evidence that we want to incorporate in the draft in the upcoming period is that actually the reducing inequality goal hasn't quite achieved so far. And the other thing about the control group, so we did really think a lot about this point. So one thing that I think I was also mentioning is that, so even though the awards were done in November 2024, we know that the process took 5 to 6 months. So if it was really the anticipation effect, another exercise that can be done is to compare counties with the awards that were announced later to those without awards, but keeping only counties that had some initial semiconductor employment. When we do that exercise, there is still an increase in employment. It's smaller than what we find here, but that's a much more conservative estimate, and that was initially what was in the proposal. So just want to mention that. Thank you.
Great. All right, let's thank the authors, Bilge, Eric, and Joe, and our discussants who've been really actively engaged all through the process, so Gabe and Penelope. So thanks very much.